Today, we put Dimension Shifter and Nibiru on trial for murder during the health of Yugioh. It's no secret that Yugioh is in a bad place recently. The metagame is highly centralizing around a couple of extremely powerful engines that are extremely frustrating to play against, and the rogue decks are somehow worse. The game also hasn't felt properly skillful in a while, has it? With complaints coming from big names in both the player sphere and the creator sphere about games feeling like you're just looking at each other's hands and deciding who's winning. And while there are clear culprits in the engine slot of the deck, we'll get to that, I promise, it seems like the two cards that come up the most when it comes to game design are in the non-engine slot. Whether it's about hand traps, the speed of the game, board breakers, combo length, use of the graveyard, the viability of rogue decks, or the skillfulness of the game, no matter what the discourse topic is, it seems we always end up with Nibiru the Primal Being and Dimension Shifter. So today, we pass judgment on these two cards. Are they culpable in the destruction of the game, or are they simply guilty of protecting us from the oncoming wave of power creep? Should they be sentenced to banning, or should they walk free? Because understanding these subjects and the underlying issues with the game of Yugioh can tell us what the problem has been with recent game design and how we can save it in the future. So without further ado, all rise and let the trial begin. Kings, queens, and monarchs of the jury, before we can pass judgment on these two cards, before we can determine their guilt in the destruction of Yugioh's health, we have to ask ourselves, what is the health of Yugioh anyway? And to do that, we're going to have to ask some bigger questions. The biggest, even. Namely, why do we play Yugioh in the first place? For most people, we weren't introduced to Yugioh because of the mechanical merits of the TCG. We were introduced to it for social reasons. We watched the anime, or we played with friends as kids, or we found community here. But since we're all here, still playing, it's a worthwhile question to ask. I mean, there's tons that we could be doing with our lives. There are other hobbies, there are other games. Why play this and not chess, or the My Little Pony tabletop role-playing game? The real answer is that chess doesn't have giant dragons and My Little Pony doesn't have cute anime girls. TCGs do have an advantage over other types of games. They're actually two games. The first one is the obvious one. You sit across the table, or the Master Duel client, or the dueling book reloading screen, and you put cards on the table that say, I win, until one of you is right. The other game is the one that comes before that, the deck building game. We as TCG players get the unique opportunity to take these shiny treasures and put them together into our own personalized arsenal, our own puzzle, our own character story. And that, if I do say so myself, is pretty damn cool. But I didn't answer the whole question, did I? Because Yugioh is one of a million trading card games. Why play this one? It certainly isn't the prizing support, and the community experience is probably best described as a found family narrative in a post-apocalypse film about a plague that was spread by snapbacks, body spray, and Hatsune Miku card decals. No, we play Yugioh because it is ostensibly fun. And both parts of the game are fun too. When you're deck building, you have 20 years worth of cards from which you get to gather your strategy. There are so many cool themes that you can choose from, and thanks to it not having a mana system, you have a lot of flexibility in mixing and matching your strategies, and you get to tune your deck very specifically to the metagame that you expect to be playing against. You could genuinely play a new deck every week for a year and still have new things to explore, and that's fucking rad. At the table, Yugioh is also uniquely fun in certain ways. It's explosive. You get to play all your best cards from the get of the game. It's also interactive. When Yu-Gi-Oh's at its best, you are never passive in the game. You always have decisions to make and opportunities to participate. And the decks just do cool stuff. I don't know what to tell you. In Yu-Gi-Oh, you get to do cool things. You get to have sneaky little interactions. The game gets cute with its rules, and the way that it blends its themes into its gameplay are unmatched. And underneath all of this is an undercurrent of skill. Yu-Gi-Oh is extremely skill testing. In deck building, the game rewards players who are creative, who have good card assessment, who understand probability well, who think critically about their practice matches, who can find interactions, recognize ratios, and metagame their opponents. Because the sky is the limit when it comes to deck building in Yu-Gi-Oh, because it's so flexible, critical thinking and an open mind are important to Yu-Gi-Oh! Even more so than I think they are to other TCGs. And at the table, that same analytical mind, that same brain for probability, for seeing lines, for bluffing, and for reading your opponent, and your ability to adapt when you receive new information is heavily rewarded in the game of Yu-Gi-Oh! And that's so sick, that's so cool, that's why we play Yu-Gi-Oh! That's what the health of Yu-Gi-Oh! Means. Now, Yu-Gi-Oh! Can't and doesn't always live up to all of these expectations. It can't always deliver every form of fun, and it doesn't always test every skill as much as it could. That's why players tend to choose parts of the game that are the most important to them. If you ask them, when those things are in play, the metagame is great, and if they're not, it's dying. This is the origin of the great tier limit debate. Ish-Tier was a deck that was so centralizing that there basically wasn't deck building that format. But the gameplay was absolutely spectacular, testing every level of skill, allowing you to do all of your explosive plays this way, that way, dancing around each other throughout the game until one player has crawled their way to the top. That was sick, but for a lot of people, not having deck building available as a part of the game really sucked. Me, I'm a little biased toward the gameplay portion. I don't get to spend a lot of time on deck building. Most of my time dedicated to the game is just sitting at a table at locals. So as long as there's a deck that's going to provide me good games, I'm pretty happy. But I think all of us can agree that Yu-Gi-Oh! Is at its best when all of these things are at play, when it's catering to all those forms of fun, and when it tests all those skills. And it does occasionally do that. Which also means it can in the future, and it's worth discussing why it doesn't right now. And finally, before we can assess the evidence, before we can go over the guilt of our two defendants today, we have to get on the same page about one last thing, and that has to do with the speed and power level of the game. Yu-Gi-Oh! Is not the same game it was 20 years ago. I think that's a good thing. I don't think Yu-Gi-Oh! Was a real game until the Duelist Genesis. But I also think it's undeniable that Yu-Gi-Oh!'s power creep has accelerated recently. The game is even arguably unrecognizable compared to 10 years ago. And that's probably here to stay. Short of a dramatic shift in the cards available, it's unlikely we'll ever return to a pre-Code of the Duelist power level, let alone a pre-Duelist Alliance one. A deck will kill you on turn 2, or set up an unwinnable situation for you turn 1. That's the explosivity. But that only happens if you do nothing to stop them. That's the interactivity. I don't think the power creep of Yu-Gi-Oh! Has to be a bad thing as long as those two things stay in balance, and therein lies the importance of hand traps and board breakers, two types of card whose purpose is to respond to the power level of the explosivity portion of the game. Hand traps do so by proactively stopping plays, and board breakers do so by reactively exploiting and punishing weaknesses in an end board. Especially in the most recent years, the level of power creep in Yu-Gi-Oh! Has meant that the power and abundance of hand traps and board breakers has needed to be higher than ever before, and that creates a frustrating situation. If a deck is so powerful going first in its extendability that it can play through even 3 hand traps and make most of its best end board, then you gotta stuff your entire deck with the thing, which then incentivizes deck building around low resource, high payoff combos. In order for a deck to survive, it's gotta have more than one card combo that gets you the whole thing, which heavily centralizes the linear combos of a deck and also really whittles down the deck building possibilities in the game. And it makes the game a lot more about random probability. You gotta count the number of hand traps and decide if you've won or not. Now, during the Ishtir era, and to a lesser extent the Agov era, it seemed like Konami had come to a new solution for this problem. Rather than relying on hand traps, which were bricks on their own, relied entirely on probability and just drawing the out, what if decks were built so that their engines could play during both turns, thus making the main part of the deck also the reactive, interactive part of the deck. This would increase the consistency of play and also improve deck building prospects. You could spec into both engine and non-engine and have them have applications during both players' turn. This created that active engagement that we want out of all parts of the Yugioh trading card game. It has its own balancing issues, but it responds to the power level of the game in a way that hand traps and board breakers hadn't properly done before. We thought that this was a new era of the game. And then the Snake Eyes came. And then the Fiendsmiths came. And it became clear that the area of game design that we were operating in wasn't just the hand traps and board breakers era. It was a new level of hand traps and board breakers era, an even more frustrating one in which the power of those hand traps and board breakers had to match the abundance of those playmakers. And so, in an era of die rolls and showing the hand traps, in an era where the game is more expensive than ever, in an era where it seems like Yu-Gi-Oh! Just isn't fun to play anymore, we come to Nibiru and Dimension Shifter. Honored members of the jury, I'm not going to lie to you and tell you that these two cards are in equal contention. And so I want to start with easily the most controversial of the two, Dimension Shifter. If Twitter is to be believed, this card is either the savior of Yu-Gi-Oh! Or the harbinger of its destruction. So it's our jobs to figure that out, to examine the evidence and determine if Dimension Shifter is either of those things. Let's start with skill. When it comes to skill, I don't think anybody's going to argue that Dimension Shifter is the next coming of the ruler-mirror match for determining which player is better. But we're here to do our due diligence, so let's examine it nonetheless. Remember how we said earlier that at the table, in-game, the skill of Yu-Gi-Oh! Is determined by a couple of things: your ability to make reads, your ability to analyze a situation and make plans, and your ability to adapt your plans to new information. If we're talking reads, Dimension Shifter fails every test. It's fired off in the draw phase. There's no playing around it, there is no reading it, there's no baiting it. You activate it in the draw phase, and it is around for 2 turns. And the only thing that stops it is a Called by the Grave, which the opponent playing the Called by the Grave is usually forced to activate. And for most decks in the game, that's the end of the game. There are some lines to be found under Dimension Shifter, but because its downside is that it lasts for 2 turns, most decks that are harmed by Shifter can't even really find a line that sets up for next turn so that they can at least get some of their disruptive plays, their reactive plays in. This also means that there isn't really any adapting to Shifter. If your deck loses to Shifter, you lose to Shifter, and if it plays around Shifter, then it probably plays Shifter itself, and the game plan was to avoid dealing with Shifter's restriction in the first place. So in-game, Shifter is a little bit of a bust. What about in deck building? After all, one of the most crucial skills when it comes to Yu-Gi-Oh! Deck building is metagaming. If you are planning on playing at an event where Shifter decks are in the meta, then you should build your deck to have lines that play around Shifter. There's just one problem with this, and it's a big problem, and it's a deep one. It turns out that Dimension Shifter doesn't do what Konami intended for it to do on development. It was made as a way to punish graveyard dumping decks, to stop players from, if you will, using the graveyard as a second hand. But that's not what it does, is it? Dimension Shifter doesn't stop you from using the graveyard excessively, it stops you from using the graveyard at all. For 2 turns. And it turns out that absolutely hoses any deck that uses the graveyard at all, with the grand exception of exactly Goaty. And that really puts a damper on metagaming, because most decks can't spec out of graveyard play. Most decks that have any reliance on the graveyard must use the graveyard at some point in order to win the game. And if this card can turn off the graveyard for 2 turns, most decks in the game just die on impact. It's not a meter for graveyard-based decks, it's the end for them. And thanks to Xenolocking and the strong theming that we normally love so much in Yu-Gi-Oh!, it's not really possible to flex between a graveyard deck and a non-graveyard deck. And it turns out that all of the best strategies in the game are graveyard decks. If you're going to compete in Yu-Gi-Oh!, you probably should play a deck that uses the graveyard some. Now, people on the internet say, you, honored member of the jury, may say, maybe that should change. Maybe we shouldn't be ruled by graveyard decks. Maybe we should limit the power of the graveyard. There's just one issue with that. That's how Yu-Gi-Oh! Is played. Since day one, Yu-Gi-Oh! Has been a graveyard-based game. Look back at the 1999 OCG. It was Exodia FTK based on Sangan and Witch of the Black Forest being discarded from your hand. That worked for some reason. Maybe not the best example. Let's move on to the starter decks. Using Monster Reborn to bring back your Summoned Skull was basically the meta then. Let's move forward to Goat, though. What was going on in Goat? You were sending Sangan to the graveyard. You were sending Witch to the graveyard. You were using things like Sinister Serpent to control your resources. Most of the things that people love about Goat control and the mirror match there has to do with the graveyard. Take it forward to Edison. Most decks in Edison utilize the graveyard. Every format in Yu-Gi-Oh's history, save for exactly Pepe, which is really one that we should be aspiring to, and Kashtira, has been a graveyard-based format. That's what Yu-Gi-Oh's about from the beginning. That was the whole theming of the game, was it was about dead things, right? We play Yu-Gi-Oh! Because it is a graveyard-based game, and bar none, the history of Yu-Gi-Oh! Has said that decks that prevent use of the graveyard have been unfun and uncool and unskillful. What was it during GOAT format? Necro Valley that did that? Edison. We've got things like Banisher of the Radiance, real fun card right there. Let's talk about Fluandereeze, a deck that uses mostly a 10-star Floodgate and a summoned from deck Vanity's Ruler in the form of Barrier Statue of the Stormwinds. How about Kashtira, a deck that relied on multiple kinds of Floodgate? Tenpai, a deck that closes the game of Yu-Gi-Oh! And opens a window of solitaire until the battle phase comes and they deal 20,000 points of damage to you. Why are we trying to promote decks that hate the graveyard? They've never been fun to play, and they've never been good for the game. Maybe we should just admit to ourselves that the graveyard is a thing you do in Yu-Gi-Oh! And now that we're looking at fun, what does Dimension Shifter do for the fun of the game? It takes you back. The thing that Dimension Shifter tests is the absolute lamest part of Yu-Gi-Oh! To test a person at. The deck that they choose to play. The thing that Dimension Shifter limits, that it punishes, is choosing to sleeve up a particular type of card. That's not fun. That prevents the diversity of the game. That prevents the flexibility of the game. That prevents the creativity of the game. It prevents the explosivity of the game. It stops both players from doing that cool thing that their deck does. From every level of the game, Dimension Shifter, as it exists now, makes the game suck. I would say let's leave it up to you to decide, but that would be stupid. This is an objectively bad card for the game. Now, maybe you can say that there is a place for a card that limits ability to just absolutely go ham on the graveyard. Sure, let's do that. But in order for a card to be good for the game and do something like that, it has to have punishes. It has to have things that you have to do in order to make it good. You have to use it at the right time. It has to be something that you can play around or have to play into or have to bait in order to play with it. It can't be something that just absolutely hoses you no matter what. And to understand that, maybe it's time that we take a look at the other card on trial today. Because Nibiru, the Primal Being, is also a card that gatekeeps decks. It is also a card that punishes you early in your deck building process if you're not ready for it. It's a card that will absolutely hose you if it gets resolved, and thanks to its being a hand trap, isn't something that you can prepare for when it comes to deck building. But I lied to you just then, because Nibiru has things about it that make it much more balanced for Dimension Shifter, things about it that I think are actually good for a game of this power level. See, the thing that Nibiru punishes is one of the most hated things that can be done in the game of Yu-Gi-Oh! Comboing off without repercussions. YouTube combo lines that throw all of their resources into one play that produces the biggest board of negates you possibly can. That's something you cannot do if Nibiru is in the game. If you are reading your opponent's Nibiru, you have to dip into a line that either plays under it, negates it, or can play after it. And that is an interesting line of gameplay, right? If you're looking at your opponent and you're starting to play cards and they aren't negating some of your most important choke points, you start to wonder, is the big board wipe in their hand? Maybe you can risk it. Maybe you think they're sitting on something like a Lightning Storm or a Dark Ruler no more, but you have to look at them to make absolutely certain. If you are a godlike reader, you can use the behavior that they've been showing you to determine which of those that might be. Maybe it's the way that they look at their hand. Maybe it's the way that they've been looking at the field or counting to themselves, if you want to use the meme example. In-game behavior is a hard thing to quantify when it comes to reads, but if you think that it might be Nibiru, you can dip into a slightly less powerful combo line, and usually you should, unless you think you're playing against a deck that wouldn't be playing it, or in a metagame where it's less common. That's a lot of interactions to plan around, and it is something that tests the skill of the player, both their ability to make the read and adapt to that information, but more importantly, the planning they do ahead of time. Most decks can and should spec into a line somewhere along the way that can play under Nibiru. Otherwise, you're just building a glass cannon deck that would lose to big hand traps anyway. Think about it. Nibiru does gatekeep deck building. There are a lot of decks that can't put up a negate before they make 5 summons. There are a lot of decks that if they get Nibiru'd, can't really continue the game. But what are these decks? If you think about it, what are they doing that makes it so powerful against them, right? These long combo lines that are fragile and result in a million negates, or floodgates in the case of heroes. Sorry, hero players, you're going to catch a lot of strays from this. And I think that that's a behavior that we should be punishing in the game of Yu-Gi-Oh! And I think that we can support those decks so that they have the ability to dip into that Nibiru safe line, to maybe hold back a little bit, or put their negate on the board early. In a world where decks are powerful enough to play through multiple hand traps, having that hand trap that is severely punishing of the most obnoxious way to play Yu-Gi-Oh! Is pretty good for the game. Nibiru and Dimension Shifter aren't causes of the problems in Yu-Gi-Oh! Actually, Dimension Shifter is. I don't know who we're kidding about this. This card sucks and it should be banned. But they are part of a bigger underlying problem in Yu-Gi-Oh!'s game design. The thing that brought us to Fiendsmith Snake Eye. This space in Yu-Gi-Oh! Where they've made the plays themselves so powerful and so low resource in their commitment that it takes something as powerful as a Nibiru, as a Dimension Shifter, or a full hand of hand traps in order to stop it. That Konami has decided to balance the game around this arms race between the power level of a first turn play and the ability of the other player to draw interaction. In this world of game design, do I wish that more cards were like Nibiru than Dimension Shifter? Absolutely. Lingering floodgates suck ass. I think we've shown effectively today that they're unskillful and unfun and bad for the game. but blowout cards are probably still necessary against decks like Fiendsmith Snake Eye. And if we have to have blowout cards, I like that the best one of them is one that punishes your opponent for not making good reads, that can be played around if you're smart enough, planned around if you're good enough in deck building. I think that that's all right, but that's not the future that I want for the game. It's not the future that's going to save Yu-Gi-Oh! At this point, make the metagame less frustrating to play against, make the game feel more skillful. In order to do that, we have to break out of this design space where it's show me how many hand traps you have in order to determine the game. And we've seen the better direction to go. We've talked about it already in this very video. It's the design space that Konami started experimenting with in the last few years before the release of the Snake Eyes, playing during both players' turns. We've seen it in Tearlament's Havness, in the Bestials, in the branded and unchained decks that do almost all of their board breaking, their playing, and their interaction within their own engines. Ban Sanctifier. In a fast and powerful metagame, hand traps are always going to be necessary, but putting the bulk of the ability to break boards and interact into the engines of decks allows them to do that cool thing they do all the time. That's great. We want to have games to be a struggle to the top through interaction, through good gameplay, through understanding your opponent's deck and your opponent's brain, and that should be happening all the time. If you think back to early Yu-Gi-Oh!, if we think back to the popularity of Edison, that's effectively what's going on, albeit over the course of multiple turns, not over the course of single plays. But if you think about the parallels between the two, if the game today is played on the axis of lines and combos, and the game then was played on the axis of turns, we were doing the exact same thing back then. The meme about Yu-Gi-Oh! Is that it doesn't have a turn 3. And while that's demonstrably untrue and also kind of obnoxious, it does point to a truth about the game, a fundamental one. That what we love about this game, that explosivity, that interactivity, means that at its best, Yu-Gi-Oh! Plays more game over the course of 2 turns than most TCGs play in 6 or 7. And that's what makes Yu-Gi-Oh! Special. That's the way that modern Yu-Gi-Oh! Should be. It should play during both turns. It should use the player's skill in deck building and in reads and adaptability in all phases of the game. And both players should get to do that cool thing that their deck does. Also, Editor RJ here, also perhaps consider not printing engines whose entire identity is that they're a splashable bundle of cards whose extenders are also starters and their starters are also extenders, and also they do the exact same line through multiple points of disruption. I feel like that's the definition of disruption. If you hit a choke point with a piece of disruption, it should change your line. Your end board should change such that the quality of hand traps matters more than the quantity of them, so you don't have a binary of either you disrupt your opponent and you win, or your opponent doesn't get disrupted enough and they do the exact same line. I feel like we should not do that. Bye. So is Nibiru guilty of ruining the metagame? No. Is Dimension Shifter? I guess not. Should it be banned anyway? Abso-fucking-lutely. But the salvation of Yu-Gi-Oh! As a game doesn't come down to the carceral fates of these 2 cards. It comes to whether Konami is willing to admit that this game is fast enough that we gotta kick up our game when it comes to how we interact with each other. And if they do, I think that future is pretty bright. Okay, I know that I said that I'm not going to leave it up to you, but let me know down in the comment section below anyway whether or not you think Dimension Shifter and Nibiru should be banned for their crimes against trading card games, and where you think the design of the game has to go in order for it to be saved. It's easy for us to talk about what we don't like about the game and say that other people's ways of fixing it aren't going to work, but what do you think? Put yourself in the mind of Konami for a second. I'd be interested to hear what you have to say. Go forward in humble confidence, my friends, and I hope you have a wonderful day.